The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu. Welcome everyone to the ELL District Collaborative. It is our second session this year, and we are happy to welcome Dr. Hannah Gribble. Dr. Gribble was recommended to us because she does good work in the classroom on the topic of increasing oral language proficiency, specifically as it aligns to the WIDA preparation for oral language and speaking. Dr. Gribble is a classroom ESL teacher, and she works in elementary level classrooms. So, Dr. Gribble, thank you for being here today. So, you may take the floor.
Thank you. As she said, I do teach in an elementary school. My background is in secondary ed, though. My first job was teaching English in the high school, and then got brought into ESL, which was a blessing. I'm a little nervous. It helps to have so many smiling faces that I know. When Kim put my name down, I think she was thinking of a tool that I use to help prepare my students for the speaking test. And we are going to get to that, but not knowing who was going to be here, what you were anticipating, what any of this was like, because I haven't been here before, I had a little bit of an aha moment in my classroom about 2 weeks ago that will kind of lead us to that tool that I use. The first thing I would like for us to do, though, is to talk about the issues that we see students facing with speaking or oral language. So, not knowing the setup or anything, I wanted you to discuss with your table, and then somebody from each table be a spokesperson, but I think we can just discuss with somebody beside you for a minute the issues that you see, and then we'll all just kind of share that out. Okay, so go ahead and talk about what problems your students have with the speaking or with oral language. Okay, if we can come back together and kind of talk as a whole group on the issues that we see. Somebody want to share something?
Yeah, we discussed like two main issues that we see throughout many ESL classrooms is this idea of authentic discourse, authentic talk between students that is academic versus more of a parroting type talk where they're kind of repeating or answering a one-word question to a partner, kind of like a turn and talk versus a full-on extended conversation. And then this idea of how does that translate into the speaking to a computer, because when you don't have that secondary person to probe, a lot of times teaching those skills internally so they can extend it on their own is very difficult. So that's a problem that we're encountering with oral language.
Okay. Anybody else?
We said the same thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just not having somebody to talk back, not knowing what else to say, if they've said enough. And mine, I think, struggle a lot with just using that or that academic language, period. Even though that's what they've been taught, that's what they're being asked to say, they just aren't comfortable saying those words. It's just not how they speak.
Okay.
I think also there's a teacher capacity issue with not wanting to embarrass those ELs in their classroom, and they don't want to call on them during classroom time. And it's a compassionate, they're being compassionate, they're not trying to, but it's an expectation level, and we have to help them get over that and raise their expectations for the ELs to participate in classroom discussions, which just kind of goes along with what Ms. Dankos.
And what we also said was the teacher in the classroom may be the only adult interaction they have, especially with the academic language, the CALP.
Sometimes you have a child, it's a cultural thing where the child is just very quiet and they don't speak loud enough. I've got a student that the teacher says he speaks like a butterfly. I mean, you can just barely hear him when he speaks. So just getting them to speak so they can be heard.
Anything else over here? Everybody's camera shy. I'm like the kids, I have the microphone, I'm like, whoa. Okay, so when I was thinking about that, my kids are terrified of the headset, the microphone. 2 years ago when we first started using the microphones, I had one student who would cry every time we practiced because the thought of that being in her face intimidated her. Academic vocabulary, which you said, and just the ability to use it. I heard some discussion over here about complete sentences, that students aren't answering often in complete sentences. And with that recording, they need to, so that whoever's listening to it can understand what the question was. The quality of language, which goes back to that academic vocabulary, the quantity of language. I heard Joseph saying that they really try to encourage their students not to push stop, that it will time them out and just to keep talking. And then grammar is one of those that I see my students struggling with, but it oddly is not the biggest struggle for them. So this is kind of what we want to hit on today. And again, I wasn't sure if I would be speaking to administrators or ESL teachers or classroom teachers. So I hope this is something you can take back to your ESL teachers, but also to your classroom teachers. I want you to think of a recent classroom discussion. And if you're an administrator, think of one that you've maybe observed lately when doing evaluations. And when you've got that discussion in your head, I want you to think of who did the most talking, were complete sentences used, who asked questions to clarify, who used the specific vocabulary that was being taught, and how many students were involved. Everybody have a discussion you can think of? Maybe? I want you to turn to somebody next to you and answer those questions. Will somebody share with us? Any volunteers? Somebody share?
I said that I'm always normally one-on-one with a kid, so yeah, and I do end up doing most of the talking, and it's harder when it's just one student. So yeah, that's a challenge.
So 2 weeks ago when Dr. Clark called and said, we want you to present on this, and I said, okay. I thought, what am I going to say? And then a conversation happened the following week. And my students, now I'll give you a bit of background. One of our ESL teachers just left ESL and moved to first grade. So I inherited her students just for the time being, and they were in the middle of reading Esperanza Rising. Okay, these are fifth graders. So I said, let's review what happened in the last few chapters before we start reading. What's happening in Esperanza's life right now? This was just, we'd missed a few days. I can't remember if it was a weekend or they'd been on a field trip, something. But it had been a couple of days since we had read the chapter, so I just wanted a quick review of what was happening. One student said, she hasn't seen Mama. Somebody else jumped in with, in a month. Why hasn't she seen Mama? Mama's sick. Why? My students are used to me asking why. She got valley fever. It was the only real grammar issue. She has valley fever. What's that? She can't breathe good. Why? The dust storm, which was one of the vocabulary things that we had been talking about, the content. the dust storm, and she has dust in her that caused an infection, which was another word we had been discussing. So why can't Esperanza see her? Because Esperanza might have germs and give her another infection. So they've got the word infection down. Okay, so what else is going on in the story? And at this point, they start guessing about what I want to hear. And one of them said, they went to the Japanese store because they're nicer to Mexicans, which was part of the story. It wasn't leading into the chapter we were about to read, so we kind of glossed over that. And Esperanza has to work. They wanted more money, which was a huge deal and came into one of the vocabulary words. I said, who wanted more money? The workers, Esperanza. Both of those things were true, but I wanted to focus on the workers because that would lead us to the vocabulary word strike, which was another one of the words I wanted them using. So we talked for a second about why Esperanza wanted more money, and then we started in with the workers. How were they going to get more money? Somebody said more work. Somebody else said they were going to strike. Now those two are complete opposite answers. And I said, what does that mean, strike? And one student said they were going to stop working. The reason this was an aha moment for me was because I have 4 students in that class. 3 of them were giving me answers. The other student is not as proficient as they are. Those 3 students who were involved in this conversation have been here since kindergarten. The 4th student has not. So his oral language is a little bit behind, and due to some medical difficulties, he's even a little bit farther behind. He had given me a paper the day before. He had had a test, or the Friday before, and he made a terrible grade. It was a social studies test. One of the words on that test, it was vocabulary, was strike. So he handed me the paper because I was going to modify it. His teacher hadn't modified anything. So I was taking it to modify so he could redo it. He missed strike. And I thought, we've spent a week talking about these migrant workers and how they're going to strike. How does he not know strike? He wasn't using strike. I was. The other students in the classroom who were more proficient with oral language were using the word strike. He had never had a chance to say the word strike truthfully. And I thought, okay, let me back up. This was the conversation that came to my mind when I thought of a classroom discussion. And if we look at this classroom discussion with the questions that I just asked you, who did most of the talking? The students did. Were complete sentences used? Very rarely. Which this was a quick review. It was 5 minutes of our hour. So not necessarily a true picture because I do try to get my students to talk in complete sentences because I know that's what's expected on WIDA Access. Who asked the questions to clarify? I did. Who used the specific vocabulary? The students did, but not all of them were involved in using that vocabulary. The thing that hit me was that sometimes my expectations are not the same as WIDA Access expectations for speaking. So I really got to thinking about the oral language that students use. I focus so much on reading and writing. I don't give them time to practice oral language as much as I should anyway. We do have practice for the speaking test that I do, which I'll talk about later, but as far as daily in the classroom, I'm not giving them enough time to use the vocabulary that we're focusing on unless I'm doing rapid fire questions and they're answering me. And I thought, if it's that way in my classroom, as an ESL teacher who is aware of the expectations, I don't know what's going on in their regular classrooms as far as that goes. With these 4 students, I can tell you that they have no time to discuss academic vocabulary or concepts with other people because of their grade level, knowing these students and knowing their teachers. So we have to look at, as ESL teachers, but also as classroom teachers, what oral language we're expecting. Is it equal to the expectation on WIDA Access? Now, it's been a couple of years since I've taught 5th graders. My 2nd graders and 1st graders, I'm always complete sentences, use a complete sentence. With 5th grade, I wasn't as focused on that. So I'm doing a disservice to my students through that. When we look at those questions, who does most of the talking? Who should do most of the talking? Students. Because to discuss something, you have to have some knowledge of that. They say if you don't know something, be required to teach it, and then you'll know it. So our students need to be able to discuss the topics to fully understand those. What language functions are students using? Who's using the academic language? How many students are talking at a time? That was a huge aha for me. And does your partner or group work require verbal communication? And so these are the things I want us to focus on, things that I hope you can take back to your teachers that are simple tweaks. In your classrooms, who does most of the talking? Most of the time it's the teacher, especially if it's in a regular classroom. Okay? So students don't have sufficient time to practice speaking academically. They have their time at lunch, they have their time at recess, between classes, whatever, but as we all know, that's the social language, not the academic language. We need to increase their interaction time. We know we need to ask open-ended questions. Okay? Our evaluations have us looking at our questioning. But we also need to have students explaining the concepts and processes to each other. As far as who's using the academic language, we know that we've got to teach them vocabulary. We've got to teach them syntax. It's got to be clear and concise. My students, when I tell them to keep talking until the microphone cuts off on WIDA Access, they ramble. And he did this, and he did this, and he did this, until it stops, which is very good for quantity of language, but not so much for the quality of language. We've got to teach them to be clear and concise, but also use those structures that we're teaching them and the vocabulary that we're teaching them. So typically, and I was guilty of this, teachers use the academic vocabulary in the whole group discussion. So our students are hearing academic language, but not using it. Okay, that's one of the main issues that my students face. They're hearing it all day long, but they never get a chance to say it. So in our district, I don't know how many students we had who did not exit ESL services due to their speaking score. And when I think about this, the teacher's the one using the academic vocabulary, not the students, I can see why. Another key is how many students are talking at a time. Typically, a teacher asks a question, calls on a student, that student answers, the teacher evaluates, is that correct or not, maybe try again. Teacher calls on another student with another question, so only one student is talking at a time. So if I said, Andrea, tell me the first step in the life cycle of a butterfly. And she gives me an answer. I know that she knows it. But if I say, I want you to get with your shoulder partner, I want you to talk about the life cycle of a butterfly, use the transition words we've been working on, because my students would know first, next, then, because we've been working on those. And here's a list of words that you need to include. Chrysalis, egg, whatever. How many students do I have talking at a time? Half the class, but everybody's expected to talk because you don't know who I'm going to call on. Okay? So we've got to change our questioning a little bit, how we do it. Not necessarily the questions, but how we're assessing students. Because if I just ask Andrea the first step, she knows it, and then I ask Tisha the next step, and she knows it, Kim may have known those two, but not the third step. But I don't know that. But if Kim's talking to Chris, and they're both discussing, they can fill in the gaps for each other, and then both of them have a chance to talk about the words that we've been talking about, the language structure we've been talking about with the transition words. Both of them are accountable because I may call on Kim because I may know that Kim's been struggling with it. Chris is going to help fill in the gaps, but they're both talking, so they both get the practice. If I had, in the discussion with my students to review Esperanza Rising, if I had said, talk to your partner, use the words infection, strike, dust storm. Talk to your partner, come up with a 3-sentence summary of what's going on. That fourth student who didn't do any talking would have had to talk because I may call on him. But the students in the discussion were already filling in the gaps for each other. You know, she hasn't seen Mama, one student said. In a month, another student said. They both could have come to a consensus on that. And then someone would have given us a 3-sentence summary, but everybody would have been responsible to talk. Does that make sense? Do you do things like that in your classroom? ESL teachers? Yes? No?
Can I say something too? I'm just sitting here thinking about it. Questioning too. I had always thought it was me asking questions and them giving me answers, but something that was like an aha moment for me was a friend of mine, we were talking and she said, they need to ask questions and they need to practice answering those questions with one another. And so I've tried to start doing more of that. Like I showed a video, something that comes to my mind to give an example. I showed a video of this, and you may have seen it, it's been like a YouTube sensation, this little girl that's a drummer. And I think she's 9 years old. And I let them watch that. And then I said, if you could interview this little girl, what are some things that you would still like to know? What are some questions that you would ask her? And then they wrote down a list of questions, and they shared those with each other. So I don't know, but just that's one thing that's kind of been helping me to think and guide my teaching.
And that is going to be out of the realm of the one-on-one students that some of the smaller districts have. And I don't know if there's a way you could schedule time for, you know, 2nd and 3rd grade so that you have 2 students to be able to talk to each other. I know your schedule's a nightmare. So the other thing I think we have to look at, what vocabulary are we teaching? Now I'll go back to my example. The student had given me a vocabulary test for social studies. 19 words, 19 definitions. Vocabulary is not isolated like that. So I don't know how much writing he does in his social studies classroom to use those words, but he's also got to be able to include those words in conversation about that topic. We have to teach, this was one of the things I didn't understand when I first started ESL, we have to teach the specific language functions and the words that belong to those for cause and effect. Because she didn't do her homework, this happened. Or since she didn't do her homework, this happened. Our students are not picking up those words just by listening to us using those words. The hardest thing for me is that I have to plan for purposeful talk, because we all know if we don't have a purpose, students are either not going to speak, or they're going to be talking about what they did Friday night. It's going to become social. They need true discussion, and for our beginners, they don't know how to do that. So we've got to scaffold that with sentence frames, word walls, things that they can use. Somewhere in the past week I've read for group discussion, have like name tents and put some sentence frames on the back of those. Then it's not as obvious that they're needing that help, which I thought was a pretty good tip, because students don't want to look like they don't know and look at the sentence starters on the wall. Purposeful talk also includes listening skills. So we're hitting two areas. If I had said earlier the partner work with the life cycle of a butterfly, Kim would have had to intently listen to Chris to fill in the gaps. But if they're discussing opinions on things, then Kim may have to share Chris's opinion, because that may be what I ask her to do. So her listening skills are going to improve because she's focusing on that. The one thing to remember is that discussion is a key ingredient of the lesson, but is not the lesson. Yes, we have to give students time to become accustomed to how we want them to interact in a group, but we can't just have classes based on discussion. They've still got to do the reading and writing, but we do need to incorporate the discussion because it builds on students' understanding. There are different ways to do partner talk, and you all know these. We've got to make sure that our discussion times include everybody, though. I was the person that hated group work. Any kind of collaborative effort, I despised it because I didn't want to talk to anybody. I would sit and just do the work, and everybody else would be discussing social things because I didn't want to talk to anybody. I don't like conversation with other people most of the time. I'm kind of a loner. So it was a big deal for me when we started doing more collaborative stuff in high school. When a teacher made us both do the assignment where everything was equal, it was a struggle for me because I was shy. Our students who are naturally shy or who know they're not language proficient have to be held accountable to the classroom discussion too. And so we've got to create that culture in our classroom. And I think as ESL teachers we do that, where our students are not afraid to make mistakes. But for regular classroom teachers, it sometimes takes some creative partnering. But these were just top of my head, what I could think of. Think, pair, share, jigsaw, find someone who, inside, outside circles. Anybody have another way they group students, randomly or not, that you want to share?
The popsicle sticks, or the name out of the hat. Hey, you two partner up. The other thing is use a timer. You have 7 seconds, to find some, and they're so busy running trying to find some. It'll work even for older kids. They're so busy trying to find somebody, they're not thinking about, oh, I'm going to have to talk.
And that gets them a little more excited about the discussion and holds them a little more accountable. Now, this is getting to the part that I think we're all struggling with, the microphones on WIDA Access. We've all got to assess our students, we know that, but finding ways to assess, that can be difficult. In bigger classrooms with more students, it's a little bit harder. Does anybody have a great way that they assess?
That we assess?
Yes, that you assess students' oral language.
So I'm working with a couple teachers right now that they have the same concern, like how do I assess that their oral language is increasing and how do I make it relative to the access? And so we just implemented where they kind of work through their unit, and at the end of the unit they do give them an opportunity to get on the computer. So they're using a couple things like Flipgrid, where they'll record a prompt and then they listen to the teacher kind of read the prompt, and then they have to immediately respond. I think Seesaw is another one that they're using in the elementary realm. But then I sit down with those teachers every 2 weeks, and we actually rate them on using the WIDA speaking rubric, and we're looking for growth, or at least that they're remaining constant to what their prior access score was. Because a lot of time we've seen them kind of go backwards, just because, if the expectation isn't there, they don't perform. So then she can set a goal specific to like what they would need to get to the next level, and then she'll chat with the students and say, well, you need to try to create a more compound sentence when you're speaking, or add a conjunction in there. So I want you to try to add, a statement and then use "and" to follow up with your next idea or something like that. She'll give them a goal for the next week to kind of implement.
Anybody else? How are you assessing your students' oral language proficiency?
I think having a checklist and a rubric that the students know of and that so that you can go around when you're not recording, when it's just a classroom traditional discussion, and you're using these expectations to have, okay, this week I'm going to assess this and try to listen to as many children. When it's one-on-one, if they know that expectation, you have to create those questions. Then sometimes it's easier when it's one-on-one in smaller groups, but to go around with the checklist and a rubric that the students know exactly what that expectation is, so that that there's no gray area. And you can go, okay, rate yourself. Sometimes students need to rate themselves. The Flipgrid is a great way for them to rate themselves, for the students to go back and listen to themselves again. And then another good website for that without video is LINGT. Is that the one you were going to talk about? I have a coworker. I'll talk about it since I didn't ask permission from anybody. I have a coworker. We created our practice WIDA test using that, so we could go back and listen to the students and give them a rating. There is a monthly fee, and we actually paid for the monthly fee so that we could have more students record. But it's not very expensive. But it's a great way for students to get on there and record themselves. So you can go back later and assess them, and more importantly, they need to learn to be self-assessors, or assess their peers or something like that. So
I agree. That's, I think, what Kim was intending when she wrote my name down. Last year, our other ESL teacher stumbled upon this website, and they have a trial. You can only do like 3 assignments, I think. But you can get on there and you can record a prompt with your microphone. Students can use the headsets and respond, and it records each response differently. They have to put their name in at the end. So it's not like several different videos on the iPad, or that they're all using one thing. It's significantly decreased the stress level, I think, of our students with that microphone. You can also get on there and type a prompt. You can incorporate pictures if you need picture support. You can have students answer verbally, or it will give them a text box if you want to practice writing. Our district has, I don't know what the plan is, Kim probably knows the plan, but we can share among the schools. So if somebody else has a really great prompt, I can get in there and use that. So I'm not always having to recreate something brand new. We actually, part of a PD day, sat down with some topics for different grade levels and tried to create prompts using copyright-free pictures, things that we knew students would encounter in their classrooms, like life cycle of a butterfly. That's an easy one to use. Do they know transition words, and can they do sequence? We did some cause and effect. There are various ways to use that. Like I said, there is a trial one you can do that doesn't have as much space, I guess. But the main thing is, it's let us have our students speaking into that microphone, which is especially important for the first graders because the kindergarten test is so different than 1st through 12th. It gives them that practice. We've had discussions on, I have a student who tends to do this when they speak in front of the computer, and so we've had discussions on, what should your posture be like when you're speaking. Another student plays with the microphone. They move it. And I played that in front of my whole group. I'm like, okay, not singling anybody out because you all try to play with this. This is what it sounds like. Or I might record myself, doing that so that they can hear. We've had discussions on using complete sentences and using the question to formulate that sentence. Recently, students were reading about Helen Keller in 2nd grade, and our target words had been blind, deaf, persevere was in there also. None of them used persevere, but they were able to, speak about her life, use the words blind and deaf, talk about how she hadn't had issues and then she had a disease and illness when she was little that caused her to be blind and deaf. So they got some good language function there. But one of my students, and I can't remember the prompt right now, started out with, because blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, let's play this back, just one-on-one with this student, because he's one of the ones that should have tested out. I said, do you even know what the question was? Based on your answer, what was the question? And he was like, I don't know. So it's been really good for those things. I haven't used it as much as I planned. But I will after Christmas to start prepping them for WIDA with the microphone. But I think the really important thing that I know that I need to work on, that I feel like most of my colleagues in ESL and in the regular classroom need to work on, is letting students talk and use the vocabulary. I know I don't do that enough. I feel like the ESL teachers in my district probably don't do that a whole lot either, because we're so pressured to get things done in time, and I've only got this hour, we're going to focus on reading and writing, and I think that's why our speaking scores are low. But if we can create those classrooms where students have to talk to each other, where they're accountable for that, and using the specific vocabulary or language structures that we want them to use, I think that's going to increase our oral language proficiency. And I've forgotten your name, I'm sorry. As she said, getting students a rubric where they can listen to themselves using one of the websites that were mentioned, they increase their awareness. I've had students say, okay, I used 3 sentences. And I'm like, you used 2 phrases, not 3 sentences. What else could you have added? That's going to be an important part of that. But they can't just do it for the test. They've got to do it in their classrooms too. So, anything anybody wants to, I am way ahead of time. Nerves got to me and I'm like, and then I know you mentioned
Flipgrid she's using, it's made to be like this Facebook-like experience where it's kind of like Snapchat but for videos. So if you have secondary students, they can absolutely record themselves and then respond to somebody else, and they can have this like virtual conversation. But for a first grader, that's not what we used it for. We didn't even use the camera aspect, we just used it for the recording aspect. And so the teacher would have her Flipgrid kind of pre-recorded, or the camera pointed down on a piece of paper with a picture and the prompt. And so they could click on hers, listen to the prompt, and then they could record theirs, and we had no cameras involved. They just used the microphone aspect. But that one worked. And then I have a lot of teachers using this Seesaw, and that gets into like virtual graphic organizing, writing. Then they can add like a whole discussion on top of it. So that's a pretty neat platform to experiment as well. And they have pre-made lessons. But a lot of our elementary school teachers in particular are liking that site as well.
Flipgrid is 100% free now. They did charge before. They're 100% free now for educators. And if you follow them on Twitter, you can find a lot of great ideas. And they do have a lot of younger students that can do that. And I used it a lot last year in my middle school classroom, and my students loved it. It was a great way for them to get used to watching themselves speak, because they're afraid that somebody's watching them, even though they don't see that camera come up on that test. They're like, what do I look like when So I think it's a great way for them to become comfortable with themselves, even watching themselves speak.
And for that aspect of the smaller districts where you don't have a student you're on a one-to-one, you could do like a Flipgrid project where they respond, they watch each other, and then they respond virtually, and you're actually having this virtual conversation, recorded over time. It would take longer to get, the responses in, but they potentially could respond and talk with other students within the district.
Is it just flipgrid.com?
Just flipgrid.com.
But our high schoolers love it.
Yeah,
they won't talk to each other, but they'll talk through a phone.
Middle schoolers love it.
And to simplify that, I'm sorry, Joseph. Last year, I observed a teacher who was just using an iPad or even a phone without the video component, but putting it on as if it were video and just pointing to nothing, basically. The teacher modeled a level 5 NINA response. And after presenting the question, a content-based question on what they had been studying. And the students, it was a third grade class, the students knew what the expectation was. They had already gone over the rubric in student-friendly language with I can, blah, blah, blah. And so after the teacher gave an example, and then the students, first she gave the level 5 example of a NINA, then she gave another example, and the students had to score her. And then it was the students' turn with a different question. And the teacher recorded all of them while they were standing in a circle. Then they all went to the table, and she played them back. Now, there's no video. It's just the oral responses. But they were all there to hear the responses of their peers. And they had the rubric there, and they scored each other, but not just with a number. They had to tell why. So now they're thinking metacognitively about what language they're producing and why, and then what they would have to do to get it to a level 5. It was a great lesson. And, not online. It was just a simple device, iPad or phone.
I was going to say, since we're into the product endorsement phase here. No, we just recently we're discussing in our district with the few Imagine Learning licenses that we have that there's a recording element of that. The students have to record in order to go on to the next thing and so on. So we just kind of came to the realization that we could actually share these video files. Like, for example, as the administrator, I can get in there and I can pull out a kid's sound file and have another teacher listen to that. So now we use that, mostly for our younger students, and they're the ones that have the least difficulty with the not handling the technology, but any fear of it, for example. They're okay. They just say what they say. But we'd like to look into something like that. And then my team started talking about, could we do something where we could use our Google suite of information so the students could look at a prompt and respond to that. But then somebody else in our team would also listen to it, as in addition to the teacher, listen to it, rate it, give some feedback to the student and how they're doing. Particularly among our secondary folks, they've noticed that students will up their game if they know there's a grade involved with it. And if the teacher says, you're going to get a grade on it, but I'm not the one who's going to be grading you on this. I know how you speak, I know how well you can do, but I want you to do something so somebody else, and they won't tell them who it is who's going to listen. It doesn't matter, it's just another ESL teacher. They'll just say, there's going to be a person that's going to rate this for you. that will suddenly, for some students, it'll scare the death out of some of them. But for some of them, it'll actually, motivate them to do something, because they will do something if it's attached to a grade, and they will not do it if they don't. It's good for you, kind of a thing. It's like eating your peas. They just won't. So we haven't gotten a way to share that yet. It exists in what we're using. We just haven't had people step up to do it. But I think it's the second semester we're going to do that. And just one other thing, this doesn't relate to a particular part of what we've been discussing here. It's just more like the nuts and bolts of administering the WIDA access. We've noticed with some of our younger students especially, we do it on Chromebooks. The trackpad is built on there. The students are pretty much free to kind of navigate themselves without the teacher being there. But we noticed on some of the speaking tests, some of the students will tap the trackpad as they're talking, and it's right at where the stop logo, the thing is on there, so they stop their talking and they're not done. Or they want to say something else. No matter how many times we've told them, don't touch the stop thing, go ahead and let it time out, somebody does that. So we've taken to putting taping an index card over that, so that you can lift it up when you need to do it, but during the speaking part it's down, so that the students are sometimes it's just a matter of nerves. They just kind of hover their fingers over it and they accidentally hit it. Put that index card over it during the speaking parts, and that'll force them to, it just lets the thing time out. And that way the kids who do have something else that they want to say suddenly can kind of get that in there, and it'll take away that tendency to accidentally hit it if they've just been kind of hovering over it nervously. Or some kids just like to click on things, and no matter how many times you tell them to not do it, they're just going to go ahead and do it. Every year, some of our feedback to WIDA includes don't have a stop button on there. There really is no need for it since it times out, and they haven't listened to us yet. But anyway, that's just because we're using Chromebooks and we can't get around the trackpad not being there. We need to come up with a way to do that. So the index card seems to be kind of to do that.
If you're going to talk about technology, I'm going to say we've really struggled with the quality of the microphone we're working with. I don't know if a lot of you all, and I find that the USB, even though they're more expensive, are worth the investment, because the ones that we buy are the headphones and they have the 2 plug-ins. They don't always work with the Windows 10 especially, and so making sure that the quality of the microphone and the headset that you have is compatible with whatever system you're working with, and checking and making sure the day before you give the test that it's working right too that day. But that's just an aside. But all those things go into our scores. It's not just how much we practice, but does the equipment work the day of the test, as we found out last year with TICA.
With those more fancier ones, there's a caveat, because they usually have mute buttons built in, and the kids will play with the mute buttons. So
we
actually,
along his line,
we would have to then tape the mute buttons. But they are clear.
I thought of taping over it, because mine will play with the volume on the
and so we taped over.
Yep, we taped over them.
That actually was a question I had when Hannah was speaking earlier about noticing that the speaking scores were significantly lower than some of the other domains, and she asked, you mentioned, I guess, that some of the kids in your district didn't exit because of that. I was just kind of curious if people, we've noticed some of that. To be honest, I'm not sure. If we asked individual teachers on my team, they'd probably come up with examples where a student was not exited and really didn't need to be in ESL. But a lot of times we found that the students are actually still benefiting from our support. It's not that they're light years ahead of everything, but they didn't exit. I mean, we're hoping for the best, of course, this year. But I was just kind of curious in the group if you found that any of those students who you suspect that they were not exiting because of that speaking domain, did you feel that was just egregious, like they really should not be in EL anymore, or were they kind of borderline anyway? I'm just curious.
Well, with us, it was some were really needed to be out of ESL. Others probably are benefiting, but we probably had 10 to 12 students that should have tested out, except the speaking score kept them in.
Yeah, because everything else was at a sufficient level that they would have exited. Okay.
One of mine in particular, I know he still benefits because he's very self-conscious, but he's terrified of the microphone. Terrified of it, to the point of freezing on the first question every year. And I have to say, it's okay, just move on. He didn't exit, and I feel like it would be beneficial for him to be in his regular classroom. It's still beneficial for him to be with me, but I don't feel like he really needs me anymore.
To add to your bag of Google Suite,
Yeah.
have you used Screencastify?
Yes, actually, some of the people on our team, I've never actually used it, but somebody in our team is really good at using that. I need to get her to do a quick mini tutorial for the rest of my folks about that one, actually.
It's a video
Yeah.
component
Yes.
that's great,
Yeah.
a great part of Google.
How have you liked Imagine Learning's product? I haven't. What do you think of that in use? It looks like a great product, and I was part of the development team, but I haven't actually been with a school district that got to use it. So I wondered if the kids found it as interesting or interactive.
Yeah, we have fully used all of our licenses, and we could if we could have the money, we'd get a few more. Honestly, we really do. We don't use it during ESL instruction. It is an additive to what they're getting throughout the day. Some kids are able to make use of it at home. I guess probably one of our larger struggles is that we have students who don't have internet access at home, and they would. So one of our teachers is looking into a possibility of a grant funding to get some hotspots that could be assigned to certain families so that they would be able to use something like that at home. So it wouldn't cost the families anything, wouldn't cost the school district anything. That's one of the challenges because we are trying to get them to use it other than in school. Well, in school, but otherwise. And but yeah, overall we do use it.
Do you think it helps with oral language as much as the written, or what is your feedback on that?
Well, the thing about Imagine Learning is it's just reading. There is no questions and responses with Imagine Learning.
Right.
So, but as far as language in general, huge.
And it has that oral
If it's
component
used with
built
fidelity.
in. You can't skip over it. Students.
They sing, they read, they all orally recorded.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can use it where, like you said, you can pull those files up and you can have them even listen to themselves reading at the beginning of the year and compare mid-year, like how do you feel like your fluency or your use of you can ask them and get them to reflect on their own abilities.
That's something I've always wished WIDA Access or WIDA Screener would be to keep the recording and writing files. Once you score it, it goes away. You don't get to go back to them. I think it would just be really valuable. I know you can download them. You have to be really aware of doing that, though, because once you've scored it, it's gone. I think it would just be really good on a screener to have that always available to do that comparison from here you were in August. This is the first thing that you and I sat down and we talked about, and you did this, and here we are now in December, and look how far you've come, or your writing looked like this at the beginning. But unfortunately, it's just something, maybe it's a space-saving kind of a thing for them. I'm not sure on their servers, but it would be great if you could always have that as a reference point for the students.
Other thing, and I think Kim mentioned this at some meeting with district-level people, and it may get a little controversial. In the WIDA Access Administration Manual, it does say if a student needs scratch paper during the speaking assessment, that they can have that.
We do. We allow them to have that.
So I didn't know that until this year. My student I was talking about who didn't exit, that I feel like should have because of the fear, that would be beneficial for him, not for all of my kids.
That's a question I actually had for this group today because I can't remember. I thought it was at the last time I was here that we talked about this, that, and I've been trying to search for it ever since then, that, there is, WIDA does recommend or does suggest that students who want to take notes during the listening or during the speaking can do that, but they don't want students to script their answers and read it because to them it sounds like a prepared answer. Well, it is, in a way, but from the rater's point of view, they wouldn't know who wrote that or something like that. Does anybody know where we heard that, or was that the last time we talked here?
It was the last meeting we talked about that, but I don't recall.
But I remember seeing it in something that was shared or that was posted or that was, and I've searched WIDA up and down since then because my teacher has asked about that, because we've had teachers having their students write out their answers and then reading from that, and their speaking score came back no better than it would have been had they just kind of off the top of their head said what they wanted. So we want our kiddos to be taking notes, but I was really looking for that thing that said don't have them write down and read from their paper.
I think it's in the same section where it mentions that.
In where? In WIDA's? Is it in the administration manual? Okay. I have to go. All right. I'll do a search there so you don't have to read the whole thing.
It feels very stilted.
Yes,
when they read
I understand that, and it does.
The
You're
intonation's
right.
not there.
I tested a student once who did exactly that. It was his own words. It was his own writing. It was not. It was him reading, and it came across that way. And his score at the end of it wasn't that great compared with. And I wasn't his instructor. I just had to give him the assessment. Was probably not what he was actually able to do. So I learned, and this was our first year of using. The first year we did the recording for it, so I didn't know any better than either. But yeah, I'll take a look at that.
I mean, for me, the PowerPoint is to keep me on track, and what I'm going to say, that would be the same thing.
Yeah.
I feel like for my students, if they're taking notes, not necessarily sentences. Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, I was going to say that the TAM says to give out scrap paper for the writing, but only to give it for the speaking if the student requests it.
Okay.
And it's just for taking notes, not to script.
All right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I'll find it, Andrea. I think I said it'll be in there.
One thing that concerns me is this is my 21st year teaching, and I taught elementary school for 20 years. This is my first time teaching junior high. And in elementary, for the WIDA test, they want to please the teacher. They just want to try their best and do their best. And I've not had any issues with this. But I've overheard conversations with my students in junior high that say they're going to, on purpose, do bad on the WIDA test because regular English is scary. They don't want to leave me. Things like that. Does other places have that?
I've taught middle school for 18 years, and many students would say, well, we don't want to do well because we want to. But here's the thing that we have found that motivates them is, and I don't know about other districts, but in our district, ESL is almost a pathway in high school. And so if they still qualify for ESL when they go to high school, they're limited in the choices for those extra classes that they can take. And one of the things that we've used to motivate them out is that they'll have a lot more opportunities when they get into high school to take more of, and we use the word fun, I don't care, but to take those classes that are not just academic. Like a lot of them want to do culinary, or I don't know what's offered at your high school, so you'd have to ask. But the students understand that there are repercussions to staying in ESL. And so that's really, you have to motivate it from what they want.
And sometimes a guilt trip, making sure they know that it's on you too. It's a score for you. It shows how well you're teaching. And then they like you that much, they're not going to destroy your reputation or whatever.
Yeah. And just reminding them that they want to show the world how smart they are. And with middle schoolers and high schoolers, you can kind of bring in politics sometimes. People think that, there are things that you want to show the world that you are smart and that you deserve to be here. So
That seems to start about 4th grade at my school, where students don't want to exit. And I point out the things that they may be missing, because occasionally their class goes outside during ESL time, unfortunately. And I'm like, you don't want to continue to miss recess, or sometimes it's snack time, and just pointing out the things that they're missing or could miss. And then for my students, so many of them rely on me for, I don't want to say emotional support at school, but it is. Because it's hard for them to fit in, especially today's political climate. They feel a little bit like they don't belong. So I always remind them, just because you don't come see me every day does not mean you can't come see me about other things. And that's helped to an extent. The kids that were on the verge of testing out but maybe didn't give it their all, to know that they can still come to me with issues. You know, moms can still call me if something's going on the bus. I haven't left you. It's just you're not going to come see me every single day for class.
I like all those ideas.
You have to find which one fits each individual student. That's the thing. That's the hard part, you know.
But I have several students who have older siblings. And anytime I see those older siblings that I had, how are your grades? School going okay? Any problems? So they see me checking on students who are not even in my building anymore. And that kind of comforts them for that aspect.
I have another question.
Okay.
I don't know how much time we have. I've got lots of questions.
20 minutes.
Okay. So one of my questions is how many folks here feel like you're having difficulty getting time with your students? In other words, they could make more progress if you could get them more time. I don't know what your scheduling looks like or if that's an ongoing issue with your school. It's been a problem with teaching reading for me as a special ed teacher, especially when I'm trying to get the ESL students, right? Because they're, you know, maybe in speech and SPED and ESL and a variety of things. Not an issue for anybody? That's good.
It's always scheduling is always an issue, especially in a small district where you're seeing multiple grades and everybody has English in the morning in the elementary school from 8 to 9:30. So it's really it's a puzzle.
I say this with hesitation since it's been a while since I've been in the classroom, but you know, when we think about one teacher having to serve all these students, it's overwhelming sometimes. And if there is a way to catalyze students into becoming peer teachers, and the ones who are already leaders in the group are the ones who are already strong in language, strong in speaking, to sometimes, and you may already do this, but to say, for example, in the conversations, to teach them how to question, to teach them how to ask each other questions. Or in this case, when we're short on time, to train them in how to lead groups or lead discussion groups and become the teacher. Just in little sporadic moments, not driving the whole program, but it sort of dispenses the teaching to more than just one adult standing in the room. And but to train their mind to understand, hey, I'm not just here receiving from her, but I'm actually going to help my friend, or I understand this, so I'm going to explain it to my friend. And if they're, you know, that's a culture, that's a classroom culture thing where they begin to even think like that I could be the one asking the questions, or I could be the one teaching my friend. Does anyone do that, or do you have students that could be that student that starts to ask the question?
At the elementary school that I teach at, I have all the ELL students, K-5, all in one class at one time because of scheduling. And I have to do that, you know, with the older ones helping the younger ones and things like that. And it's from 2 to 2:55 during their recess and snack every day. And they never get recess and snack every day, and so they're missing out on that. Plus, it's not a good situation. And but the older ones do help the younger ones.
And then where that's sort of a vertical kind of thing, older to younger, I think you could also do it parallel, you know, peer to peer and younger peer to peer. Again, though, y'all are the ones doing it. It's just an idea. It's an idea. It may work, it may not.
So when you talk about have students ask languages, any of you know about Project Lit Community It came from Jared Amato out of Maplewood High School in Metro. It's not an ESL thing. But what it is it's creating book clubs where the students drive the discussions around the books. And when students are reading things that they want to read, this is a middle school and high school, geared toward middle school and high school. When students are reading the things that they want to read and they want to begin to start those discussions, it goes back to teaching them how to create those discussions. If you give them a purpose for that discussion, we're going to get together once a month and read this book that you all have chosen to read, and you all are going to drive that, and you create those leaders, then those students learn how to create those questions. And I think that could be done in a mini way in ESL classrooms. She mentioned Esperanza Rising. Esperanza Rising is a great novel, probably 4th grade through 8th grade, to read with students. And there are so many out there geared toward ESL students that when they get to choose their own literature and then they have to make those questions around that literature and create those discussions, then that is a focus, and it takes the job away from we're doing this so we're getting you to talk to we're getting you so you're going to discuss something that you're passionate about. And then they'll learn to create those questions. It's just an idea. And if you all don't follow Project Lit Community, it's on Twitter mostly. It's at Project Lit Com, COMM, and Jared Amato, who was a SCORE teacher, and so he created this. He's a
How do you spell his name?
JARREDAMATO. I don't know. I'm a big Twitter junkie, so y'all will have to. Most of my references come, but if just looking at the selection of the books, there's some great ones in there for middle school called and they're all the latest novels. First Rule of Punk, some others, and then if you're a Title I school or you have low income, you can go to First Book, which is a company, and they sell things very, very cheaply, and so it's a way for you to get books for your classroom. I think you have to be a Title I school or have low income. I'm not exactly sure how that works.
They'll send boxes.
Yeah, you can, but there's a great selection on there, and they are working with Project Lit Community to get a lot of those books.
So, Dr. Clark, to kind of play off of your idea of getting students to turn around and be the teacher or the prober in conversations, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, but I've worked with a lot of our teachers with something called academic conversations, and it focuses on 4 or 5 core conversation skills that teaches the students. So, like, for example, might be how to come to a clearer idea, but it's kind of coming from the research of Zweers. I think it's ZWIE, can't spell it right now, RRS, I think.
Something like that.
Or 2 E's and an R and an S, but kind of on there. But I've been working with a lot of our teachers. It's really you have to have accountable talk kind of flowing in your room, but taking it to the next level so you can release the kids to have these authentic conversations. So,
The name of it again, please?
It's literally called Academic Conversations, and it's coming out of some research in California, and they saw a need with the ESL students that they weren't having. They would have these input, they would input, but there wasn't actual discourse or conversation, and they weren't playing off of each other's ideas. So he kind of saw that ESL students needed more scaffold, so it's a way to scaffold and try to get your kids to have those authentic conversations.
And one factor that may play into it that we know in the refugee students is they may be coming out of a school culture where they walk in the room and they sit there and they're quiet. And then they listen to the teacher and then they walk out. Well, American schools aren't typically like that. And so we can't presume that they just come right into a collaborative learning situation and know how to do that and realize that they have some autonomy, that they can take initiative. And so it might just be that the getting a mindset before we even can expect them to be the questioner in the group to understand, hey, you can take the lead here too.
Do most of you feel like that collaborative work is going on in the regular classrooms? I don't see that much at my school.
When I made that statement, I said, this is a presumption I have. And I defer to you on what you see and know is happening.
I feel like most of my students are going in and sitting.
So it may
And
be
they're
then
lost.
that teachers are not in that mindset. And it may be hard to train students to be in that mindset if some teachers aren't quite there yet. So maybe some teacher training first.
I feel like the elementary realm has a lot more interaction in the classroom than your secondary classrooms. But I think there's a shift happening in math classrooms where there's a lot more talking and conversation in secondary classrooms. But honestly, when you have 25 students that you're trying to manage, you put those group activities out there for kids, but you can't authentically manage each group to see the quality of what's happening within that group work. And so, I think they just don't have the awareness of structures in place that can help guide the students to creating authentic group work. They put it out there, they might do a jigsaw, but what happens in the jigsaw once they put it out there, they try facilitating it. When you have 25 kids, it's difficult to gauge the quality of what's happening. So I do feel that elementary school in general tries to incorporate a lot of, at least there's a big shift in turn and talk. We see that in a lot of reading classes. They're trying to get them to at least turn and talk and increase the amount of students that are actually participating in a question. But yeah, authentic collaboration, I don't feel like is happening as well as it could.
And it's tough because the class sizes get really big in high school. My classes were 35. So, yeah.
And then you're just managing behaviors too. If you get into too much group work, it could go a little bit dangerous.
And I'll say, as a former secondary person, I was not taught anything about Jigsaw or anything like that until I started working on my ESL endorsement. I had no idea what that was because it just wasn't taught. I was trained in my content area, not necessarily in more teaching strategies.
Part of how to impact that may be to find the secondary ed teachers who are doing these things and who are having success with it, and then let them take the lead on helping. Well, not necessarily take the lead. They may not be committed to that, but to find where it is working and use that as an example for training others to see. Because if I, who have only worked with pre-K through 8th grade, even presume to suggest something to a high school chemistry teacher, I don't have legitimacy. Where if someone who is in high school and doing it can suggest it, then they are more likely to listen because they say, oh yeah, they know what we're doing.
I know my experience, I always ask my high school students, what do you want our classroom to be like? It's your classroom. I already know this stuff. You're here to learn it. How does that need to look for you so that you're comfortable in here? And the one thing they always go back to is, why can't it be like when we were in elementary school? Why can't we do group work? Why can't we do stations? They really like station work. Why can't we do pick our own projects? Why is our classroom not, I liked all the decorations from elementary school. Some things I didn't expect. I wouldn't think they would want it to look that kiddie, but really deep down, they're still kids. And they like that social thing.
I was encountered a 8th grade teacher the other day in the office, and he was kind of just kidding around and saying how he puts his kids to sleep every afternoon. And I jokingly said, well, maybe you should sing and dance about your curriculum or whatever. And I mean, it really wasn't a joke. It's like, maybe you should be more energetic. But yeah, that kind of thing doesn't happen in those secondary classrooms as often as it should. And I think that really would facilitate the learning a lot more.
If you think of the environment itself in the secondary classroom, it's rows of desks. It's very rare to have a table of students together or desks together, where in our elementary classrooms, they're all grouped. Our kindergartners don't really have desks, they have tables. because it's all collaborative. What'd you say?
Or
Balls to sit on.
or cushions.
Yeah.
So does anyone in this room have an example in your district of someone doing really nice, effective, authentic work with high school kids and English learner high schools, in the high school? Anybody? That you can tell us about?
We can research it. I think it's hard for all of us in our fields to kind of see what those classrooms look like. I don't randomly walk into like a math high school course and say, hey, can I just, sit here and be a part of the class? We actually have one school where we are shadowing a lot more general ed classrooms, and it's been a neat experience because you see everything on the spectrum from the class where our students sit the entire time and maybe didn't do anything as a punishment just because, I'm not going to teach you if you don't need to be taught, versus classrooms where the kids are alive and talking and excited. But it's hard to get in there and see what each, type of classroom looks like. That's a unique experience.
Well, I don't work in high schools. I only work in K-8 because I'm just in the title schools in Rutherford County. But I'm going to start really honing in on that and the two middle schools that I work with. And I will definitely find somebody that we can talk about and use and talk to that teacher. So, but I wouldn't want to mention anything right here, right now, without because a lot of us may have something in our heads, but we have to speak with teachers before we can sometimes share that stuff, because that is their domain, their world.
I don't have any idea about the high school, but I will say from an elementary perspective, I share a room with a lady that her previous job was with the state education department, and she has told me, she said she's in all of the classrooms. We have a second and third grade school, and she says that she notices when my students are in my classroom, they're talking a lot. But when she goes into the other classrooms, they're very quiet and reserved, and they will not speak unless they're called upon. And so I don't know, she says she's trying to bring awareness about that. She's a very good advocate for those students. And the same 4 domains that I'm focusing on, she's beginning to tell the other teachers, this is good for all students. We need to be doing this. And so I think, the shift is there. And we're seeing results from it. Fluency scores have gone way up, and comprehension scores. And
That's great. So, again, what I said in October, and based on y'all's feedback, is that we'd like to have a real good focus in this year on how to give support to gen ed teachers who have English learners. And so as we talk more about it, I need y'all's help to figure out exactly what does that look like. Do we bring it to you and then you take it to gen ed? Do we bring gen ed in, or do we put it on video and give it to everybody and it's shown at school level? So be thinking, how could we have an impact and give support and maybe retrain gen ed teachers? Because when they are successful, your work is supported, correct? So, rather than, I just believe we have a mechanism here that we could have some impact there and figure out a way. So be thinking about, what does that look like? And tell me.
Well, with the requirement by the state for our WIDA training, it is becoming more and more imperative that we work with these general education teachers, because they're supposed to have that WIDA training, the WIDA standards, the WIDA levels. And so I think that gives us an avenue to get them engaged in this conversation as well. And then principals are more in tune now because the 10% of their overall score comes from their WIDA score. And if they have 8 students, we know that if you only have 8 students in your county, then it really is only going to count toward the county and not the individual schools. But you know, that there's a tie-in now that we've never had before to engage principals and gen ed teachers.
Right.
So
Because for oral language, it's got to be happening in the gen ed classrooms. Do we have gen ed teachers in the room right now? I know you told us when we came. Yes?
yet.
Joanne?
Somebody
Okay.
else in here that's Gen Ed, yeah? No? Well, I'll represent.
And so, you know, in future collaboratives, if you could bring a gen ed teacher with you when you come. And I know that's easy for me to say, but for them to get out of class for a day. But, you know, if you could bring this message to your principal and say, I'd like to bring a gen ed teacher with me to this next. And by the way, I have the dates right here. I'm going to give them to you in a few minutes of our next one.
I just wanted to go back to when we spoke earlier about the scrap paper for the speaking in the WIDA Access. The TAM page 102 says scratch paper should be distributed to each student for the writing test. For the listening and reading test, students can request to use this as needed. Use of scratch paper during the speaking test is permissible in specific situations and at the professional discretion of the test administrator. However, use of scratch paper during the speaking test is discouraged, as students writing a draft of their spoken responses may compromise the validity of the test.
I think the way I'm going to approach that is, you know, bullets, take notes. You can't write out the whole thing.
But we have to train them how to do that. You can't just go, you're going to do this, and not train them how to do that. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions, comments before we all head to lunch? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's important where you can to think about intentional placement. You know those teachers at the secondary level. You know that one science teacher that really embraces ESL students, that puts things on the wall and provides the support that they need. So have a good working relationship with your guidance counselor and try to get them into the classes where they can excel, because it's just very difficult for some teachers. It's very difficult.
Thank you for your time. Sorry I talked so fast.
This is oral. If you're a time for someone